Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Learning from the Front Lines, the Community Rapporteur Session. And this is a CATIE-CAHR collaboration where the community scholars from CAHR come together with the CATIE rapporteurs. And we look at the conference. We attend all of the sessions. Every evening after the conference is over, we get together, we hash out everything that happened, and we try to bring a community lens to what happened. And these conversations are really interesting to see how the research that's presented at CAHR may affect the work of people who are working on the front lines. People come every evening, we have supper, we discuss, and then we get together this presentation. And we have 4 volunteers here together who are from each of the 4 tracks. The first one, basic science, is always a little more difficult to get people to volunteer to do because sometimes it's a little more difficult to see how that applies to our work. But I think we have a good presentation, and we'll just start right away. I've asked all of our rapporteurs to tell you a little bit about the work they do before they go into their rapporteuring. So our first presenter is Brooke Biggin, and he's going to discuss basic science.
Hello, everybody. So I'm going to talk about basic science this morning, so the struggle is real. So just bear with me. Are there any basic scientists left in the room? Okay. Please be gracious. So what I do, I run the queer work that we do at Hcv Edmonton. I also just started on Thursday an additional role with the Alberta Community Council on HIV as the provincial PHA coordinator, and I'm also the founder and lead facilitator of the Edmonton Men's Health Collective, which is an exciting grassroots queer men's health initiative, if anybody wants to check us out. So getting to basic science, first of all, the title is fairly misleading. There's not much that is basic for me about basic science, but it was really great over the days to actually discuss certain concepts and to try to build some linkages towards the work that we do on the front lines. Oh, I was supposed to do that, so there it is, nice slide. On to the first one. So looking at the plenary session, which was done by Dr. Ute, I'm pretty sure that we all understand to a degree the impact that inflammation has on the health of people living with HIV and its association with increased comorbidities and mortality. And so really what some of this research was looking at was, the hope that early initiation of ART during acute HIV infection could stop or potentially even reverse the impact of inflammation on people who are living with HIV. So some information was presented from the RV254 Bangkok study, which did show that suppressive ART in early infection did decrease inflammation. However, it did not normalize it. And so some of the clinical outcomes or impacts are unknown at this point. And as of now, what we know for sure is that the only absolute way to halt the impact of inflammation on people living with HIV would be to prevent HIV infection in the first place. There was also information presented regarding the importance of repairing the gut barrier. So we learned that the gut barrier and microbial translocation from the gut is an important contributor toward chronic inflammation in HIV, and that the IL-22 and IL-22 receptor axis is important in repairing the gut barrier, but we don't know how long this actually takes to restore. So in a clinical trial, Connie Kim showed that after a year of ART, initiated in early HIV infection, the IL-22 and IL-22 receptor axis was normalized. However, there was still evidence of gut barrier damage and blood and gut inflammation. And so this just shows us the importance of this particular area of research and just how complex the system is when we look at repairing the gut barrier. The presenter did share with us, that it's likely that this area of research involves mechanisms that were not explored in this study. So we'll see what happens in that area over time. So let's get this word right. Hydroxychloroquine, is that right? Yes, queen, right? So that's the only queen I know, right? Another area of research that we were looking at was still kind of linked to inflammation, but from a different perspective. So we looked at how in basic science there's research looking into the ways that we can decrease the risk of HIV infection through the use of anti-inflammatory drugs so that we can reduce the immune activation and inflammation. And so HCQ and ASA, otherwise known as aspirin essentially, is what they looked at. And it was showing that these anti-inflammatory agents can reduce the number of HIV target cells, both systematically and in the female genital tract, without actually suppressing the immune system, which was key. And another thing that we really liked about this research that was presented through some oral abstracts and in the poster sessions as well was that they engaged women in Kenya as a part of the research, and we thought that was really important, and we do believe that there are more ways for basic science in the future to ensure that they are engaging the community in their research. Okay, and so this, I got excited about this one because this was like literally the only thing that I sat there and was like, I have some idea of what's going on. And so it was looking at hepatitis C, and anybody who specifically works with men who have sex with men understands that this is a really exciting area right now. And so it was Jeffrey, I believe, I forget his last name currently. I did track him down and say, I'm going to talk about you. Is this correct? So it's been vetted. But it was looking at mixed HCV infection. And so mixed HCV infection is more likely to be found in certain vulnerable populations, such as people who inject drugs and amongst men who have sex with men. And so you would find mixed HCV infection essentially if the individual had cleared one infection and then was reinfected, or if that individual had just been infected with more than one genotype. And so the first implication that I thought about is because this specifically impacts particular vulnerable populations, we need to do a better job at just communicating HCV risk to these populations, particularly amongst men who have sex with men. It's a conversation that's just starting. You would have seen a poster that Glenn Betteridge from CTAC did. I'm involved in that project. I believe it's Hep C, Sex and Me, or Me, Hep C and Sex, something. Anyway, talk to me after. But was really starting to look at sexual transmission of HCV amongst men who have sex with men. And the other thing we need to do for these particular populations who, whether due to drug-related or sexual behavior, may be more frequently exposed to HCV infection, we need to make sure that they're aware of the fact that reinfection is a thing and that you can be infected with more than one genotype. There is also potential public health concern that's highlighted here when we look at mixed HCV infections. So the current direct-acting antivirals that are used are typically genotype specific, right? And we do know that HCV, when it is diagnosed, we're not always successful in terms of diagnosing the correct genotype, and there's a chance that less prevalent or less dominant genotypes may not be detected. So if we do really, really well at treating more prevalent genotypes or the more dominant ones, then we could potentially see the prevalence of those genotypes decrease. However, we're not effectively diagnosing and treating the less dominant genotypes. We could actually see those expand amongst populations where there's increased HCV prevalence. I have 4 seconds. Thank you very much.
So next, Track B, Clinical Sciences, we have Kristen Kvakic, who's going to present.
Good morning, thank you. So as Michael said, my name is Kristen Kvakic, and I'm the Director of Programs at an organization called AIDS Vancouver Island, and we provide harm reduction and HIV and HCV supports and services across Vancouver Island. So our home base is in Victoria, but we also have offices in Nanaimo, Comox, Courtenay, and Campbell River. So I'm really happy to be here today, and I'd just really like to thank CAHR and most of all CATIE for this excellent opportunity. I find I really learn quite a lot. Even after 12 years at AVI, I'm still learning new things every time I come to conferences like this. So clinical sciences is the track that I'm representing today, and I'll start with our plenary, which was Prep at Age 5, Growing Up Fast, by Dr. Jared Baton. And we all agreed that this was one of the most well-done plenaries any of us had ever been to in our history of conferences. The relatability of the scientific information and the treatment information to the story of Dr. Baton's child at age 5 made it very made the information very easily understood and kept us engaged the whole time. So thank you and well done if you happen to be in the room. And our takeaway messages from that session were really that PrEP doesn't have to be perfect, that it pushes us to think differently and it works. And some of the comments that Dr. Baton made were that we need to remember that PrEP is not for everyone and it's not forever. But for people who are at highest risk of contracting HIV, it is a very effective tool in the toolbox to reduce rates of infection. And mostly that rare events of transmission do not negate the positive impacts of PrEP that we've seen so far. There was a lot about co-infection in the clinical sciences stream, and so our minds really went to thinking about people who are co-infected, and also the fact that a number of people that we work with who are co-infected are also people who use drugs. And one of the things that we noticed was that clinical science language and the way that clinical science information is often presented in conferences is highly stigmatizing to people who use injection drugs. And we'd really like to see some shifts in that in the future. I think we can do better. There are other ways we can talk about how people take risks and how people live their lives that don't reinforce stigma. So comments like, drug use causes cognitive impairment, calling people high-risk women or high-risk MSM, to our mind really denies the impact of the social determinants of health. And there is ample research that talks about environments of risk. And so people find themselves in environments of risk. They themselves are not high risk. Brian Conway, excellent presentation, and the main takeaway from that was how we can use the medical system as a tool for social change. And I think that speaks to my earlier comment about our language and how even introducing a new lexicon within the medical system can be a liberatory and emancipatory way of practicing and can help build bridges between clinicians and the people they're trying to serve. Non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, this is here under the co-infection slide, and it fits here, but it also is kind of an outlier in that what we learned was that people with HIV are experiencing high rates of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and these are people who are not co-infected. So clearly more information and more research is needed around the impact of liver disease on people living with HIV. Women was another big focus of the clinical track this year, and not surprisingly, the statistics that were presented to us in the various research sessions confirmed that women living with HIV have a lower life expectancy than both HIV positive and HIV negative men, and also HIV negative women. And so we know that, again, drawing on our understanding of the social determinants of health, that there is a lot of work to be done to provide the kind of interventions and supports for women to live longer and experience a higher quality of life despite their HIV infection. Clearly also more information on women and PrEP is needed, and this was discussed in the plenary that the research so far has shown that not higher doses, but more pills around PrEP are needed in order to suppress or protect the vaginal tract. So that is an under-researched area, and would like to see more research on that. And also a good reminder that marginalized and vulnerable women are more likely to have a detectable viral load. And again, we can directly link that to experiences around social determinants of health. We really wanted to center our conversation last night, and we spent a lot of time talking about the research that was presented around Indigenous women's experiences, and really reminding ourselves that those intersections of racism, colonialism, poverty, and violence create environments and hold women in these environments of risk that prevent them from really realizing their true potential and also really improving their quality of life. One of the quotes from the Sisters of Fire workshop was, "I know my own body, listening is healing, listening is medicine, and our stories are sacred," which again really speaks to we need to have a much better relationship between clinical practice and social support, and there is a role for care providers to really build those relationships with people, which sometimes means setting aside some of your clinical goals and actually working on building that relationship first. Also, we need research with women who are not pregnant, parenting, or sex working. There seems to be a lot of research focused on women who are of reproductive age and who are wanting to get pregnant and to give birth and parent, and that is very important research. But there is a whole host of women who are living with HIV and who are at risk for contracting HIV who are not represented in current research, and we'd like to see movement on that going forward. Moving forward, our recommendation for people who are in the room who are going to be applying for research grants is to please stop the trauma train. We have a decade of research around the impact of childhood adverse experience, the impact of trauma on people's lives. We know that it is damaging, that it causes harm, and that people who are suffering need healing opportunities. And yet we do not have research or programs or support to move us beyond that conversation. And what we heard in some of the workshops was that researchers were looking at wanting to know from people who were already traumatized more about their trauma stories. And our question as frontline practitioners was, what does that leave you at the end of the day besides someone repeating their trauma story and you having nowhere to send them to assist with their healing? So let's spend the next 10 years, hopefully not 10 years, but developing the research that we need so that programs that do provide healing opportunities for people aren't consistently underfunded or losing their funding. Research must be relevant to people living with HIV. Your words are powerful, and I'll end with a quote from Renee Mashing, which is, "You have to make yourself someone people want to tell." And again, that really just speaks to the importance of clinicians building relationships. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristen. We'll move on to track C, and we have Tanya Wiebe, who is going to be doing the rapporteuring on epidemiology and public health.
Hello. I'm Tanya Wiebe. I work at Nine Circles Community Health Center here in Winnipeg. I've worked there for the last 10 years. For the last 6, I've been health promotion program coordinator. So I coordinate a lot of our group programming and a lot of our support services, including our weekly food bank there. I also just wanted to take this opportunity to thank CATIE and CAHR for having us come down here for this opportunity. CATIE for taking such good care of us. We spent the evenings kind of going through the information that we learned during the days, and that was really useful for me in kind of debriefing and even just remembering, because it's sure a lot of information to take in during the day. And I also want to thank all of the researchers here for the work that you do, for providing the evidence that really supports us in finding direction for our programming and also in securing funding for our programming. So thanks for that. Jamie Blanchard did the plenary for this track, and it was one of my favorites. I really appreciated how he mapped out how structural interventions work on a large scale and community mobilization works on a small scale or a local level. I thought that's really useful in thinking about directions for programming, and also he highlighted that failure to articulate and measure programs can consign them to a low priority for funding. So it's just highlighting the importance of evaluation and research and evidence in programming. And then a lot in the track focused on HIV in different key populations. So I'm just going to go through some of the things that we pulled out as a group related to certain key populations that we heard about. So repeat PEP users should be considered for PrEP, as recurring PEP is an indicator for ongoing risk, something that I hadn't really thought about before, but was mentioned a couple of times. That was interesting. And so we also looked at social and structural correlates of HIV risk and care. The CEDAR project, I saw a couple of presentations on that. That's a really super interesting project to me as a prairie person as well, but something going on in BC. They showed us that engagement in integrated health programs like offered at the Dr. Peter Center is shown to be helpful to support people who use drugs to achieve viral load suppression. So just supporting people at the stage of life that they're in and supporting them where they're at actually kind of is what creates those health outcomes. So just providing more evidence for programs like mine. Thank you. And also one of the highlights for me was Dr. Mona Lutfi's presentation. I found really, really interesting. I really liked how she encouraged thinking about heterosexual sex as a risk category, separating it into two different categories, consensual and non-consensual sex, and just the effect of checking that box for somebody who didn't experience sex in a consensual way, how that might feel for them, and the importance of thinking about what those boxes we're checking off feels like for our clients. And she had provided us with the evidence that coercive sex was the third most common reported category of transmission after consensual sex and sharing needles when she actually teased out the data. I thought that was really important. And then we also learned that youth sex workers are less likely to engage in condom use when they have food insecurity, leading to the conclusion that condoms should be made available when doing outreach with food. And finally, we looked at the multidisciplinary HIV in the global context sessions that were happening. One of the things that we pulled out as a group is that for youth in Brazil, they found that greater self-efficacy, brought greater adherence, and that this could actually be something that could translate locally. And then epidemiology of HIV and co-infection. So that was also a really interesting talk. And the good news is that there's been an increase in HIV positive women in Canada that are having children. So the word's getting out there that this is a possibility. People are hopeful about their futures, and people are hopeful about a healthy future. But then interestingly, just in 2015, there were 3 perinatal transmissions all in Saskatchewan. So as a group, we thought maybe that was something that further programs or research could be looked at for. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanya. So we'll move on to our last track, track D, probably the track that most of the people in our Learning Institute wanted to be part of, and we have more slides than all of the others. But Shauna Fay, has told me that she's going to do it in 7 minutes. Yep.
All right, so as mentioned, I'm Shauna. I work at Nine Circles Community Health Center. So I do health education and harm reduction services for people living with HIV, but also other community groups who are interested in that. So we are doing track D, which is the social sciences. So all of the activists and frontline workers want to be in that one. We're the most verbose, and we have the least amount of time, so we're going to try and do this as best as we can. We really came to the sessions looking for the human story in the statistics, so that's really what we tried to tease out of things. Not surprisingly, our group was really enthusiastic about all of the things that Stephanie Nixon had to say. There were several ideas and points that she made that we really connected with. I'm not going to read them all, but she got us started. We started off right with that first morning plenary. I just want to point out that her point of most rehabilitation does not take place in the healthcare setting really reinforces a lot of the self-management principles that I use in my practice. Next. Oh, this is still with Stephanie. And though it was only at the tail end of her presentation, she articulated very briefly her experience of acknowledging colonization and the impact it has on the work. She ended there and had about 30 seconds left to thank all of her sponsors and everything. So that's something that we'd like to hear more about, of how do you go about acknowledging colonization and working through that with your clients. The oral presentations about Indigenous health, we were all extremely eager to go and attend. And it was really interesting to hear about research as culture and approach things through that lens. That was really interesting. And it highlighted the importance of storytelling for us, the importance of relationships, and the importance of building community when you're going in to learn about people and to provide services, of really taking your time and getting to know that community and them getting to know us. During the lunch symposium, we got to hear about lived experience with someone living with HIV, so that was a refreshing change. And we also got to hear about the struggle, the new emerging struggle of people aging with HIV, and the idea of exceptionalism versus integration in how we're going to combat that struggle. So it's something that we're going to have to address as we move forward with our populations. All right, innovative approaches and outcomes in social sciences, HIV research. So I won't read all of these, but there were a lot of things that connected with us. One thought / wish that I had was that Colin Hastings could present his findings on HIV criminalization in the media, not only to CAHR, but also to, say, the CBC, the CRTC, because we know what that looks like in the media, HIV criminalization, but I would like for his findings to be more widely dispersed among the people who can have an impact with that. Again, the other opportunities that we had to hear from lived experience, and just like Kristen said, listening is healing, listening is medicine, and our stories are sacred. That really spoke to us. All right. The one link that we definitely noticed that researchers were digging for was the voices of the people who are often unheard in research. We were all delighted when the research concluded also with practical guidelines and a tool that we could take home to our home communities, not just the conclusion that further research was necessary. So we really liked it when tools came out of the research. Yeah, and like I said, hearing the voices of people who may be under-researched or often go unheard. We also, though, the tools and the how-tos gave us a lot of optimism as we go back into our communities and continue the work. We are also tempered our optimism by reflecting on the very well-articulated systematic failure that Alex Wong pointed out in his studies in Saskatchewan. So even though we are really enthusiastic about going back home, we want to remember that there is a crisis happening and that we should try and remain balanced and keep that need at the urgent level that we need to act now. And the posters were amazing. There's too much to say about the posters because there's too many posters and we're all visual, wonderful people, but it certainly got us talking at the tables. And one thing that I would be interested in as a health educator and someone who's worked in literacy and someone who really tries to get the knowledge translation through right to the people we're working with is figuring out a way that we can design posters that clients can also understand. Because it's great that we can understand this information, but large bulks of text are a turnoff for a lot of people, and it would be really nice to be able to widely share the information. So the posters that had really great big pictures and stuff, I gravitated to right away, and I know a lot of people in our center would love to read those. So thank you very much.
So that's it for us today, and I'd like to thank once again Brooke, Kristen, Tanya, and Shauna, but also the larger group of people who came together each day, each evening, and all of the discussions that we had. I know for ourselves, the CATIE educators who are here, that it's such a rich and rewarding experience to be able to speak with the people that we work with in this environment. I'd just like to have that group of people who you've probably seen with their little cards in the different sessions, writing down their notes, just stand up for a moment before we leave. Thank you. Thank you very much.